So what I want to talk about today is, given what we've seen from Web 2 and what we know about Web 3 already, how do we keep from feeding our society to the AI monster? Quick info hazard warning here. If you've ever heard of Roka's Basilisk, there's a possibility that if some things are true, the Basilisk could haunt you. So if that bothers you, feel free to step out now. Okay, so we're at a really interesting place in history, right? There's evolution of physical organisms began with the evolution of information itself. The first information explosion led to civilization, right? Like as soon as someone could write the king's edict on a stone tablet, now they could have a large kingdom instead of just a small village. Obviously, we all know about the second information explosion, which led to the Industrial Revolution following the printing press. And right now, we're at this new information explosion, and we don't quite know what we are creating. So the Basilisk, I'm just going to define it real quick here. So the idea is there is an AI being that already exists, may exist soon in the future, and if we don't do everything that we can to get it created, it may torture people who have the capability but don't actually participate, right? While the Basilisk is a little bit of a fanciful idea, there are certainly mechanisms in our world that approach the Basilisk, whether those are human bureaucracies or just the pressure of culture. Okay, so the technology we're creating today will have long-term, inescapable consequences, especially when it comes to the blockchain. So what type of world will we design for ourselves? So with Web 2, what we saw was every system tends towards complete or optimization on the part of the platform itself, right? The optimization function tends to be, we want to drive user activity because user activity is upstream of profit. So the side effect of that, as we see in like social media today, is that in order to drive profit, the companies are willing to tolerate a certain amount of controversy, polarization, and potentially that can explode, as we've seen in Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, things like that. How it's going. So even though the optimization of these algorithms generates a lot of controversy, a lot of polarization, we do have a couple things that save us from the potentially large consequences that we could actually wind up seeing, right? So the system's super inefficient right now. It's a lot of different systems owned by individual companies that don't want to cooperate together, so no one has a complete data set. The data is not concentrated either. So we don't really have a Basilisk. We wind up having kind of just this thing that approaches a Basilisk, but it's still very mechanical. It clanks around a lot, and it doesn't quite it can't exert the efficiency that we might see in the future. So when that comes to gaming, closed ecosystems in traditional gaming so far are optimized towards extracting value, obviously, right? This takes place at the level of distributors, at the level of publishers, and the level of games. Every game wants to get you locked into their system. We all know this. Wants you to invest a lot in playing. And the more that you invest, the less likely you are to leave that ecosystem. And this is just, standard gameplay and standard investment into one particular game system. At the higher tiers, this looks like the player behavior itself outside the game becomes governed by the publishers. So one really clear example of this was in 2019 when the Hearthstone player Blitzchung spoke out about the Hong Kong protests. He was banned from the tournament and effectively ended his career, right? So we already see that private game publishers are making decisions that influence people's livelihoods and their way of life. And that's just now with an inefficient system that is not all-encompassing. When we get to Web 3, we see the data is eternal, right? Like we all here presume to believe that the blockchain will live forever, that the data on the blockchain will live forever. The incentives are built in, which is amazing, right? Like that's one of the reasons that inspired me to pursue a career in Web 3. But at the same time, everyone can look back at all of the incentives that have driven people over time as well. And the system overall is highly efficient, right? I don't mean in terms of, obviously, blockchain itself is pretty inefficient, but the systems that we are creating, because the incentives are built into the mechanisms themselves, there's not a lot that is lost in translation. And the data is pretty freely available from system to system because it's all on chain. So the Basilisk is lurking. This is like the ultimate setup for what the Basilisk wants, right? We've got tons of behavioral data. Tons of behavioral data on-chain, freely available. We have a really good understanding of what incentives drive people and which ones do not. And we have like the potential of huge scale. As more and more games get into the play to earn, the gravity of this problem will grow quite a bit. If you're familiar with the paperclip problem, as an example, in which an AI that is charged with making paperclips, pursues the goal of paperclip making to the extent that it begins to destroy all of the environment and potentially the entire planet that it's able to access, right? It's pursuing the intended goal of making the paperclips, but it doesn't care about what else it might destroy along the way. When we think about understanding what motivates humans, and again, we have incentive data, like what keeps people engaged with the system. We also have, in competitive team sports, we have the potential to understand how people coordinate and how people work together. If a situation arises in the future where we decide, hey, this system isn't working right, well, now the system might understand how we would try to band together to change the system, which becomes kind of a crazy problem as well. Okay, so the primary burden of AI safety does belong with the AI community, right? But this is definitely a give and take scenario, right? We don't want to feed the Basilisk. So how can we avoid feeding the Basilisk? Well, basically, I can see this working in one of two ways, right? So we've got, on the one hand, small player communities that cultivate their own IP and create community-owned media dynamos. We already are seeing this to an extent as some of the NFT projects from late last year begin to gain steam. The free markets that these independent communities build their IP and grow their media communities on could become a source of huge economic growth. This would be great for society. We need economic growth in new places. And so this could be a huge boon for us. And the portability and freedom of choice allowed by Web3 could allow a new stage of industry to thrive, right? Like the virtual economy could become complete, and we could have this wonderful peer-to-peer ecosystem where everyone makes money from new ways of work playing together. Or, I just picked Amazon as a hypothetical. Amazon could create an AI to govern a massive play-to-earn two-company store flywheel, right? In which they have complete control over not just what you do in-game, not just what you do in your consumption, but more and more social data gets sucked in. They might be able to have much more say in our lives. Or it could not even be a company. Generalized superintelligence could potentially will itself into existence or escape the bounds of the team that created it and have even pick its own goal and optimize human civilization toward that goal. Okay, so with all of that said, what are some things that game designers, should be thinking about as we begin to create? Open IP, this is an obvious one, but open IP that is not controlled is, actually, let me back up for 1 second. Yeah, okay, so backing up a little bit, the options seem to be to allow, to encourage communities to own their own things and own their own IP, their own media, and on the other hand, basically, when it comes to the Basilisk, right, we can control it or be controlled by it. And right now, no one's totally sure whether or not we can actually control AI once AGI becomes a thing, right? So maybe the next best bet is not to control it, but to make sure that it can't control us. And this is kind of where the chaos theory comes into play, right? So how to make sure that the Basilisk cannot control us? Well, OpenIP is a great place to start, right? If the ownership of IP assets and community media is distributed across enough people, then ostensibly one party, like whether it is captured by organizations or captured by AI, OpenIP is resistant to that form of capture. Another potential solution is obviously give players as much control as possible. And this is not just over the assets of their game, but over the game design itself, which relates to the next principle. Design systems should be composable and organic. And so this is, I have a project called Funbug, which is an engine for play to earn. One of the key principles there is that scoring mechanisms and the scoring mechanisms within the game should be governed by the community itself. The idea being if the system itself is somewhat unpredictable, it will resist capture in a way that a system that has a completely solvable scoring mechanism or value transfer mechanism is able to be captured by someone with enough money and math, right? Kind of like an example of capture. Actually, this would be an attack, but a lot of people think that the collapse of the Luna stablecoin might have been caused by a very clever short strategy with enough money behind it to make sure that they could collapse the token entirely. That's an example of not capture, just destruction, but similar principles at play. Enough money, enough math, and you can figure out how to crack the system. So a game engine, game engines that are composable and organic, swappable over the course of play will resist that type of capture. Design for great experiences over lock-in, right? So it doesn't necessarily, while Web 2 was driven by making sure that people would come to your game and have sticky behavior within your game, we want to focus on just having the value of the experience be the reason that people come back and return over parameters in your game that are designed to make sure that people cannot leave. And just generally chaos in the loop, right? Again, if we can't necessarily control the Basilisk because we don't know what it will look like, because we don't know what the control mechanisms will be, if we encourage enough chaos in the game systems themselves, and again, this could be through randomly changing scoring parameters, this could be through ensuring that over time some assets get destroyed or some assets get created in somewhat arbitrary and unpredictable ways. Chaos is very difficult to predict, and even the kinds of statistics and predictive math that AI is built on will ideally have a very difficult time negotiating a game that is chaotic at its core. So that's it. Thank you very much. Questions? Yeah.
I'm not sure whether your ideas will really work, because players are people. People follow the mass follows a leader. So whenever you want to control a system, you just need to find a couple of people who can eventually control the masses. So even if you're not called Amazon, they will find somebody who will lead the masses, and they will feel like, okay, we're making the decisions. But we see that with every DAO, it's always 2 or 3 people who make the proposals, and the masses just follow. It's not democracy. And I think this will happen in any system.
It's an interesting challenge. Yeah, that's actually something that I struggle with quite a bit, right? That is a dark inevitability that we have to think about. I do hope that given enough scale and competition across multiple axes and not just a single axis might be ways to at least slow down the consolidation of power in that way. So again, in game design, that looks like maybe having multiple objectives multiple forms of accruing value. It's a little bit counter to the traditional ideas of creating a token that's valuable where number go up. But a good example I see in one of my favorite NFTs is built. It's actually the original soulbound NFT. When you transfer it, it doesn't leave your wallet, it creates a new one. And the process of people transferring this token from one person to the next creates a big graph, right? And so you can see who has distributed this NFT the most. You can see who was closest to the genesis of this token. And it kind of creates a whole new paradigm of KPIs that people could pursue, right? And it's less about a traditionally economically viable token where a number go up. It's more about where you are in the graph. This is an entirely new axis of incentive or goal keeping, score keeping that we could encourage that could be totally orthogonal to a more straightforward number go up type of token in the core of your game. And I hope that having these multiple planes might be a way to prevent that consolidation of power, possibly. Make the goals compete amongst themselves to the extent that you can.
Thank you. I'm interested in blockchain-based game. So, do you have any ideas or no cases to avoid the speculation in the initial term in the token economy, but still maintain the long-term growth in token prices?
Cases of avoiding. Yeah, that's interesting. So my best idea on that is just to launch, and again, this is something I'm exploring with Funbug, but the idea is if there are many different games that all unite on one economic ecosystem that only have a portion of the total pool of tokens, then ideally, what happens in one, if there's 10 games and they each get 10% of the tokens, even if one column gets captured or one of those games does just succumb to totally number go up, maybe the other games will not follow suit quite so fast. So best idea there is just distribute the base as broadly as possible from day one.
Sorry, it's me again.
Yeah.
But are we talking here about gaming or creating a virtual society? Because, people come into a game because they want to play, they want to escape reality. They don't want to think about politics in the game and accumulation of power and making decisions. They want to escape all of that nonsense because that's what they face in reality. Now, if I join a game and then I have to make serious decisions to prevent my data from being captured by somebody and economic scales and stuff like that, it's not a game anymore, it's a copy of reality, and I'm not interested in that.
Yeah, of course. So I am addressing this message to game designers and people who are interested in building these type of NFT economies. I do not think that the end user should be concerned with much of this at all unless they want to be, right? So I do imagine that as a player of Magic the Gathering, there are some times where I would really like to give some feedback to the design team, right? You can see on message boards all the time, complaints about power scaling and things like that. So there are certainly a number of activist users in any game that would likely, and the important thing is to provide a path to those type of players where they can engage at the level of the founding team with the right amount of power and influence. But no, overall, do not want the average player to have to worry about any of this. This should all be handled by the design team.
But then you're looking at different audiences because you have players who don't mind to pay to play, and then you have others who want to make a living from it. In Central Europe, most people will not think about play to earn to make a living because the time you have to put into it to make a living is ridiculous compared to having a normal job. But if we're talking Philippines or African countries, South America, therefore people would be viable to do play to earn. But it's a completely different mindset. So I don't know whether as a game designer you can bring those two worlds together in equal rights or equal communities.
Yeah, that's a very tough challenge. And I don't think we've seen a play to earn game ecosystem really address that problem comprehensively yet. Hopefully we will.
You've spoken about open IP and things like that. And actually, where you came from was the data that is being collected by companies that lock in the players. Now, the generation of data by players doesn't depend on open IP and game design. The data is just generated. Now, how would those things protect our data or help us to maintain our privacy when playing? Just because it's openly available, it doesn't prevent anybody from getting information out of this data. It becomes actually easier because it's openly available.
Yeah. So again, in my imagination of the situation, I think the data being collected is non-negotiable. It's going to happen and it's going to be here forever, right? So how do we make sure that the parameters around that data shift enough or have the ability to shift enough that they can't get totally captured? Like one example actually is in tabletop role-playing, totally not blockchain at all, there's a design system called Dungeon Crawl Classics, and they have effectively an open source license on their game itself. And that player community evolves very, very rapidly. Lots of new game systems are spawned using forks of that core game mechanism all the time, different iterations for different like worlds and times, et cetera, et cetera. So because it is because the design system is not totally centralized, like the Wizards of the Coast competitor of that game, the player community gets engaged a lot more. There's no data being captured there, but the parameters are constantly changing. So if someone wanted to capture all the data there, right? Like if a big portion of the user base migrates to from the like sci-fi version of the game to the Western version of the game, then as that happens, a lot of the parameters of gameplay that create data that do get captured change fundamentally, right? So if we can, again, like this evolving model ideally creates a situation where long-term capture cannot take place.
I mean, isn't data valuable to a game developer? I mean, you can ask your players, but if I ask in the audience who watches porn, nobody will raise his hand. If I look at the browser data, we'll get a different picture, you know? So is the data not important? Because the truth is in the data, not in what the DAO says or what the democratic decision-making process says, but the data is the truth.
Yeah, of course. Again, I assume that the data will get captured, and I assume that the game designer publisher will take their best actions based on the data that's captured as well. The problem is if the system itself gets captured, then we wind up in a very bad place. And if the data stream that we create, so if the system itself is vulnerable to capture, and then the entire data stream becomes extremely predictable. And that is like the most dangerous doomsday scenario in my mind, right? Where all of the human actions that are possible become extremely predictable. And then the macro system can start to push human behavior at more and more life-consuming levels of behavioral modification can take place.
Hi, because you mentioned entering some chaos into the system to make it less predictable, right? And we were talking about up until now about collecting data and how exactly what you mentioned, like predicting the user's behavior. And I was curious, what are your thoughts on using AI tools that generate content? Like, for example, we have now GPT-3, DALL-E, which are tools that generate artwork, for example, or generate text to actually, in a way, use an AI to combat an AI. What are your thoughts on that? So inputting AI-driven generated content into the system.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't seen a lot of, I wonder how predictable the outputs of AI actually wind up being in the long term. But at the same time, I do think that we have to learn how to live side by side with super intelligence effectively, right? So I am all for components of game design, components of the system being generated by AI, absolutely. Again, the problem comes down when the entire system becomes vulnerable to capture by a large-scale information machine. All right, thank you very much, everybody.